Hey, CNFers and Atavistians, it's that time of the month for an extra podcast. Happy Halloween, by the way. We'll be digging into this month's Atavist piece, and there are some spoilers. You've been warned. Oh, and some of you know, I like to crack open a beer on this podcast from time to time. Sometimes it contains alcohol. Well, let's face it, most of the time, but sometimes it's also a near beer. I'm a brand ambassador for Athletic Brewing, a brewery that makes my favorite non-alcoholic beer. And if you use the promo code BrendanO at checkout, you get 20% off your first order. Head to athleticbrewing.com and order yourself some of the best non-alcoholic beer I think you'll ever drink. I mean it. Also, they don't sponsor the podcast. This is just me spreading the word. I get points towards like flair and beer, but no money. So go ahead, check them out.
That's exactly the subconscious tickle. I can die happy now.
Oh hey, it's CNF Pod, the creative nonfiction podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Today's guest is JB MacKinnon, who has a wonderful piece, as they all are, in this month's Atavist, about the resilience of cows. The editor of this piece, the esteemed Jonah Ogles, called this story a shaggy dog story. And it's not a pejorative. It's a story that would have a hard time finding a home anywhere else besides the Atavist. And I love these stories, and it's a nice change of pace as we start to close out the Atavist calendar year. Magazine.atavist.com. Go there, subscribe. I don't get any kickbacks from subscriptions. You know my recommendation is true. Just here to celebrate everything that they do. JB digs into a lot of brilliant things about the reporting and the writing and everything like that. The pitch, promotion, it's great. I think you're really going to have fun with this one, but we'll tease that out a bit later. Show notes to this episode, and at last count about 1 billion. Yes, 1 billion others are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you may also sign up for my up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. That's where I like to hang out. I don't like to hang out on social media very much, but I am one to put a lot of effort into a kick-ass newsletter that I think entertains, gives you value, and sticks it to the algorithm. Right up the algorithm's keister. If that's your thing, sign up. Been doing it for a lot of years. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. It's here where I will kindly remind you that leaving kind reviews on Apple Podcasts helps validate the enterprise for the wayward CNFer. At one point or another, you too were a wayward CNFer. And think how much seeing a bunch of reviews helped you make an informed download and subscription. Also, there's patreon.com/CNFpod. Helps keep the lights on at CNFpod HQ. The show is free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. Go on, shop around, see if there's a tier that appeals to you. We have 2 new members I'd like to give props to, Brandon M. Stickney and Marilyn Paulino. Thank you so much. And also for the other patrons who are still aboard. It's amazing. It's nice to see it grow, and it's great to see people stick around. So the support means the world. You have no idea. Okay, we're going to turn the wheel over to lead editor Jonah Ogles right now. We're going to do the little thing where I get out of the car and I'm going to go into the other chair, and then I'm going to put Jonah in that car and give him the keys and say, all right, just the seat. It is your turn to drive. You ready? Let's do this. Riff. Wow, I didn't know what to make of this one. It's really good, but at the same time, I'm like, this is wild. This is pretty trippy.
Yeah, I know. It's a good one for us to do. I remember when I first took the job with the Atavist, I was actually playing tennis with the Atavist copy editor, and who was also the outside copy editor at the time, and I was sort of picking his brain because he'd been working for the Atavist for a long time, and I was like, well, what is like what's your favorite way of describing an Atavist story, or how do you think about it? And he said that the thing he loved about Atavist stories is that, or his favorite ones were sort of the shaggy dog stories that maybe wouldn't have a home anywhere else, but were compelling in sort of their own way, but not quite the way that like an Outside or a GQ or Vanity Fair story might be. And this is like a classic shaggy dog story, because it's a little odd. The James meanders quite a bit in from the narrative itself to explore other things, and it's just it's not your traditional magazine story, but it's really a fun read and worth telling and reading about, I think.
Yeah, what did this pitch look like when it came across your desk?
Yeah, I mean, he basically, he pitched the story. I mean, he hooked us with the cows. There's a hurricane, cows are swept out to sea. Remarkably, some of them survive. Okay, so right there, you've like checked sort of the tension check box. But he said in the pitch he wanted to use it as a door to discuss cows and what we know about them and how little we know about them and what we think maybe we're learning about them and what the story might exemplify. And we liked that. And I think it's a story that we would have liked in any pitch meeting. Sometimes, you assign a story that you think maybe you would have rejected in another meeting if people hadn't been in the right mood. I don't think that's quite the case with this one, but I was, I think, in a receptive mood. Maybe we've had a lot of, just very sort of like straightforward, classic, good magazine stories, and this one felt different, and I think we were in the mood to do something a little different.
What makes this piece, in a way, for lack of a better term, I would say maybe dangerous for, let's just say, I don't know, the beef industry or anyone who has a certain measure of cognitive dissonance between how the industrialized cattle industry, speaking of nothing of like chicken and pork and all that stuff, are treated, is that a lot of people find cows as just kind of like these dopey, dull-witted meat factories unto themselves. But this, as JB's reporting pans out, is like they might be aware of far more like a sentience on the level of animals that we historically would never consume, and would be horrified if they were treated as poorly as industrialized cows are.
Yeah. It's sort of a sideways way into that, because I think, we've had pitches before about, sort of like exposés of industrial animal agriculture. Yeah. Which, like, don't get me wrong, I'm sympathetic to that. I can read those stories when I see them, because I feel like we sort of owe it to ourselves. This does that. This approaches some of the same thorny questions without, or I guess it's with a narrative that is really compelling and that sort of keeps you moving through. And it's a good, I hope people like it, and I hope they feel like they learned something from it. I learned all sorts of things, and I had a couple of cows when I was growing up. My dad works for the USDA and has spent like literally his career working with farmers to graze cows in more holistic ways. So I was like, I'm a bit of a believer already. Like our cows had names when we were growing up. We slept. My sisters slept with them the first night we got them in the barn. So I was already I'm here for this story, ready to take everything in, and still was surprised by what I learned, by what the reporting turned up.
What was really kind of a fun nugget to read about here too was at first the media was reporting out that the surviving cows might have been swimming for upwards of 4 hours, and we're like, okay, that's a long time to be bobbing out there in turbulent waters to find some random island out there on the Outer Banks.
Yeah.
But it turns out it could have been at minimum 7.5, but maybe as long as 25 hours, and that just speaks to some incredible resilience that maybe we would never attribute to cattle, wild or domesticated.
Yeah. I think that's the great question posed in this, is what do we make of this? Does it go beyond merely survival instinct? Because look, throughout anything, a human, a dog, into water like that, and odds of survival are not great. And, so the great question that James explores in this is, well, what if it's not just luck? What if it's not just survival instinct? And what does that say about this species? It's an interesting read. It's one of those that I feel like I know when we have a good story when I've started telling people about the pitch, as soon as I get it. And this is one of those stories that basically anytime I'm talking to someone new and they ask what's happening with work, I'm excited to talk about this story. It just sticks with you.
And what I always love getting your insights on are the unique editorial or editor puzzle making that you aim to solve, solving the puzzle of a particular piece. So for you, when you were reading early drafts and working with James, how did that puzzle manifest itself this time around?
Well, this one was one of the easy ones on the editing front. It came in mostly in the form you see it now. I think we moved a few things around. Most of what I did was trimming, and most of that came from a rather long section about climate change, which obviously is a thing, so I wasn't trimming it out because I don't believe in it or anything.
Jonah Ogle's climate denier? What?
Yeah. There's this cow and climate change overlap, which I think most people are aware of, with methane gases, and cows being either the industrial agriculture, being rightly, I think, vilified for its role, or even just cows themselves being vilified for existing in such a great number, which is obviously out of their control. So we had this big section about what it means, and there's a hurricane, so there's a climate change aspect to that. There's the Outer Banks, there's a climate change aspect to that, and so the big question for me as an editor was basically, how do we balance this narrative and these more, what I thought of as more interesting philosophical questions, with these important issues, sort of current issue type things that we have to mention, we have to talk about, but how long do we need to talk about them? And so really, all I had to do in this one was tighten things up and say, okay, I think we can make our point in this many words instead of the original number. And James has been just an absolute pleasure to work with, and is always really receptive to that. So this one actually didn't require a big tear it apart, put it back together. It was really just refinement of particular arguments and ideas. Oh,
fantastic! Well, as always, Jonah, this is always fun to get a sense of your side of the table when you're working on these things. And and this piece is Yeah, it was really fun and a nice. It's nice to see like stories like this, like when you start looking at the helicopter view of the entire like Atavist calendar for the year, like, you know, just going back a couple months, we, you know, Sayward's investigative piece, which is really heavy. You know, last month was Cassidy's adventure piece, and then this one has a bit of a. It's great in that it feels a bit more lighthearted and it's a little shorter. So it in the pacing of the year, I think it's like a really well placed piece.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah, I mean, even though we're not a traditional magazine, we do pay attention to the mix.
Yeah.
And this is a good one. We like doing these types of stories. So I hope, you know, I hope writers who have something similar think of us when they stumble onto these types of ideas.
Yeah, shaggy dog stories. I like that.
Shaggy dogs, send them our way. We're dog lovers over here.
Always fun jamming with Jonah. But now it's time to bring in the lead guitarist, J.B. MacKinnon. He's the author or the co-author of 5 books of nonfiction. He's an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, National Geographic, and The Atlantic. I don't know. I haven't heard of them. As well as the Best American Science and Nature writing anthologies. He is an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of British Columbia, where he teaches feature writing. That's cool. Man, I wish I could take a feature writing class with JB. Visit jbmckinnon.com to learn more about JB and his work. Follow him on Twitter at jbmckinnon. MacKinnon. 3 N's. Are we still cool with Twitter now that we're in the Musk era? I'm not so sure. I'm just going to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of that. Stay tuned. But for now, it's time to dig into the pitch, the reporting, and the writing of this piece. Great stuff here, CNFers. Ooh.
It came across my radar just as one of those news stories that floats around and then you kind of seize on it and you think, I think there's more to that. And so there was this kind of weird, brief media circus around the idea that these cows had somehow swum from one island to another in a hurricane off the coast of North Carolina. And it was just presented as this quirky good news story. But I thought, you know, there's got to be more to this. I mean, it seemed to me like it had to be more extraordinary than met the eye, and it certainly turned out to be that way.
When people sometimes think like, how do you get your story ideas? And I think oftentimes a great well of story ideas is often these things that are just momentarily sensational. They're just kind of quirky on the surface, but then the hit and run reporters move on as they must. But sort of the narratively driven reporters will be like, you know what, there's something more there. So maybe on the surface, like your instincts told you there was more there, but what was telling you there was more there?
Really, I think the swim, probably also the story kind of intersected with a story that has been lingering on my mind for some years, which I wrote years ago for an outdoors magazine here in Canada. And it was about this polar bear that had been radio tagged and satellite collared and all of that kind of thing. And then it jumped into the ocean and set off to swim out to the sea ice, which I guess is something polar bears do in Alaska. And they're used to it being quite a ways. Like they're used to having to swim 100 kilometers or something out to the sea ice. This one, because of ice retreat, this one swam for 700 kilometers across 9 days in continuous swimming. I mean, there was no way that it was able to sleep in the water. It had a cub with it when it entered the ocean, and it didn't have one by the time it came out. So somewhere along the line, the cub drowned. And it was just this incredible feat of perseverance and just sheer physical power, and kind of blew my mind. And so I've had this, my eye has been open to animal survival stories since then. And when I saw this one with the cows, I mean, even though it was described as a swim of 4 miles in the media, it was still a class 1 hurricane. And even 4 miles. I mean, one of my first thoughts was like, cows can swim. And I realized I don't really, I don't know how extraordinary this is, but it seems pretty incredible. And I wanted to, I thought this might be the cow version of my polar bear swim. And then, of course, cows, we have such a weird relationship with cows. And I started thinking this might be not only just kind of a cool take on the survival story genre, but it might have important things to say about how we relate to cattle.
Oh, it certainly gets you to, and people at large, like to interrogate your relationship to them. They're not just, dull-witted meat factories unto themselves. They, that they could in fact have, or and do have, a high degree of intelligence and sentience and a drive to survive, and that can be problematic for people who consume them as food. So that starts to throw a wrinkle into how people will view them. I think that's kind of a central tenet of your story, I think.
Yeah, I was kind of pitching this story as the perfect storm meets Consider the Lobster. So David Foster Wallace's famous essay about lobsters and whether we should eat them. And, that story starts out as just this delightful, jaunty travelogue to a lobster festival in Maine. And then it turns into this kind of harrowing Peter Singer-like essay on animal welfare. And this one, I thought had kind of similar kind of potential because you could, the narrative is incredible. I mean, it's just the story that turns out to be much more incredible than the initial reporting suggested as a survival story. But at the same time, you're starting to realize throughout it, as I did, that it's hard to explain how so few cattle survived this swim when a whole herd of them was washed into the water, and so was an entire herd of horses. How did just 3 cattle survive this swim if it didn't come down in some way to their individual willpower, their conscious desire to stay alive? And if individual cattle have these kinds of capacities, then yeah, I mean, something more complicated is staring back at us in the meat aisle of the grocery store than I think almost any of us has considered.
Well, yeah, it's, with the 3 cattle who survive, or we can say at first, like maybe 3.5, and, 2 might have been drawn or driven by their own herd mentality to survive together. And then the one, which is sort of we can call it the central figure, the central bovine, turns out to be with calf. So, and that suggests an entire new level of a drive to survive. It was beyond her own survival.
Yeah. So, right, we've got this pregnant cow who turns out to be, I mean, that is certainly the orneriest of the cattle. Survives the swim on its own, apparently, is then very difficult to round up and take back home, and just a real battler on, in every direction. And then, yeah, it turns out to have done the swim pregnant. And of course, this is one of the unanswerable questions of the piece, but we do raise it and think it, I do kind of think aloud about it. I mean, was this cow motivated not only by a desire to save its own life, but a desire to save the life of its calf? And I should just say here too, that this is one of the instances where, as I reported, deeper into this story, I just kept going like, what? First all I hear about is, some cows swam through a hurricane. Well, that's cool. Then I hear, that they may be descendants of Spanish colonial cattle thrown overboard, 400 years ago. Then I hear that one of them was pregnant. Then I hear that it gave birth to a calf. And then I hear that the calf was born with one brown eye and one blue eye, as though to be kind of surf and turf expressed through its eyes. So this story just was one of those ones that just kept on giving and was so fun to work on.
Now let's back up to maybe how you establish a pitch for this story. Like you said, it was like this polar bear meets Consider the Lobster. So when you're thinking of where you want to land this piece, and of course it lands with the Atavist, how are you selling the piece and selling the notion of it to be like, yeah, it sounds really weird and quirky, but like let's give this a shot.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tricky one because I was really excited about the story, and I had just finished my last book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, and I was exhausted, and I wanted to do some kind of story that was going to be a little lighter, a little more fun, and so I started picking away at this one, and I just got so excited about it. I just started researching it and reporting it. I basically had it more or less. I had the research more or less complete, other than needing to make a trip out to the actual location where this whole story played out on Cedar Island in North Carolina. So it wasn't really until that point where I thought, who's going to publish this? and then it wasn't until then that it struck me that this is indeed a quirky story that not every editor is going to look at and think, oh yeah, I see what you're up to here. And so I made a very short list of places that I thought might be interested, and the Atavist of those really kind of made the most sense. I just thought that they, partly I just thought, well, they've done these kinds of survival in extreme circumstances type stories before, and so they may naturally be attracted to a story of that same type, but with everything kind of made unfamiliar. I mean, instead of humans, we've got cows, and that makes it. And instead of, I think one of the limitations of the survival genre is that often the only takeaway you get is kind of, wow, human perseverance. It can be amazing, but in this one, you're saying, wow. A cow's perseverance, it can be amazing. Why? Like how, in what way is a cow's survival similar to or different from how a human would survive in the same kinds of circumstances? And again, it just kind of crashes us up against the human-cow relationship and takes us to a deeper place than I think is usually possible in a survival narrative.
Nice. And as we kind of put the story on the table and give it an autopsy of sorts, what was the process by which you went about the reporting and the research of this? Given that our central figures are essentially non-English speaking.
Yeah, indeed. That was certainly something I had to give some thought to, and so I just thought, well, I will try to track down anyone who knows the inside of a cow's head. And that turns out to be a pretty limited group of people. And again, this kind of gets into that human-cow relationship territory. There really wasn't until recently very much research being done on cows as individuals, or on cows, the psychology of cows, for example, or even how cows communicate with one another. And of course, there are reasons that research wasn't done until recently, and it's because these are not questions that society is hankering to investigate across a history in which we eat a lot of cows. So it's really only recently that folks like Monica Padilla de la Torre and Lori Marino and some other folks have started to investigate these kinds of questions. So I talked to those people, and they were good enough not only to share with me their research, but also to actually sit through interviews in which I said things like, at what point in the journey of these cows do you think they might have experienced loss? or grieved? How would they have communicated to one another as a storm surge set upon them? And they really helped me build scenes that hopefully bring this story to life in the absence of the ability to interview the protagonists.
Getting to the reporting and the interviewing of experts, where I mean, at some point or another, you have to, as anyone doing this kind of work, you kind of have to be okay asking questions that feel kind of silly, but ultimately it gets to building scenes and and in this case, getting into the headspace of a cow. So maybe over the course of your your career to date, and certainly with this story, how have you developed a certain degree of training or in comfort with asking these questions that seem kind of inane on the surface, but really fundamentally help shape the story you're looking to write?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's even just normally reporting scenes. I find people find that experience very unfamiliar, because most people's impression of a reporter or a journalist is that they're going to come and sort of ask just facts. They're going to fire some questions at the interview subject, and they're going to get to respond, yes, no, and that'll be done. And then, so as soon as you're starting to ask, well, what color was your jacket, and what, I remember asking some biologists who'd shot a wolf one time. I was just saying, they said, oh yeah, we went down there with guns and we had to wait for this wolf because it had to be destroyed. And I was like, what kind of guns? And, it ended up becoming quite an operation to extract that information, because they start to wonder, like, why do you need these details? And there's something about probing for details that makes people just naturally suspicious. I think maybe particularly in this day and age, I just tend to approach it by saying, look, I need to paint a picture in words, and I need the reader to be able to see what you saw or experience what you experienced within their mind's eye as a reader. And I find that, most people can go along with that. But I also find that it usually requires going back to interviewees more than once, and just trying to develop that level of comfort through a bit of relationship building. In this case, though, it was actually strange. I mean, the sources, cow people just turned out to be amazing people, and people didn't blink an eye. They were just like, oh yeah, okay, well, let's walk through this. You want to drill for details? Great. I want to help make this story come to life.
Yeah, they're in Robert Caro's memoir, Working, where he talks about more or less his process, how he's gone about doing these Titanic biographies on Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson. One of his central questions when he's interviewing somebody is just be like, what did you see, or what did they see? Like, if I were standing over your shoulder, what would I be witnessing? And oftentimes like, oh, I don't know. And he just keeps going at him and kind of pecking at him. Oh, okay. Oh, so you saw that tree in the distance. There's just my own interpretation, but you saw a tree. What was that tree? Was it windy? Did you, and so on and so on. And it seems so banal to the person asking, like, why, like you said, why is this important? But when you get to that degree of granularity, when you weren't there to witness it yourself, it just paints such a nice three-dimensional picture that it really immerses the reader. And that's ultimately what we're after.
Yeah, I've used exactly that line. I've used that line, like, if I was standing there beside you, what would I be seeing? I've used exactly that line. And all of this really came to a head during COVID, when you couldn't travel. And you couldn't go to these sites, right? You couldn't go to locations and kind of paint scenes. And so a lot of the work, a lot of the detailed description that appears in the piece doesn't come from my actual visit to the location. It comes from the reporting I did sitting right where I'm sitting now at the desk that I work at, and talking to people on Zoom or on the telephone. The story I just mentioned, where I was writing about these conservation officers who were waiting for a wolf, I wrote that entire scene, and then I went back and looked at it, and I was like, the only detail that I ended up using from a visit to the actual location was a description of like the shape of the beach and a kind of shell that's found on that beach. And everything else in the scene had come from reporting the scene.
And when you get all your information together from your reporting and your research, at what point do you feel confident to start writing?
I think I feel confident to start writing. I guess there's that old phrase, when you meet yourself coming the other direction. I think that is really has been my experience of it, that at some point I'm talking to people who are saying like, you should talk to so-and-so, and it's somebody I've already spoken to, or I'm reading research that is saying something that already appears in my notes. And once I've kind of started hitting enough indicators like that, then I feel like, okay, my research has become focused enough, and I've pushed it far enough along that that it's time to put something down on the screen.
Now, are you much of an outliner once you get all your information together?
I really used to be. I mean, I'm somebody I spent a lot of time earlier in my career thinking about structure, a lot of time, and probably because it was a weakness initially. And so I used to do a lot of outlining, and I used to do a lot of, just sort of a lot of doodling around structure. At this point, I actually think that I have ingested structure to the point where I generally have a pretty plain sense when I sit down to write of how the piece is going to start, where I think it's going to end, and kind of what the basic big blocks are within it. I've got some general sense of, what the arc is, how long it is, all of those kinds of things. And so now I can, I mean, the great thing about having gone through the agony of focusing on structure for a while is that now it's become intuitive. It's gone back to feeling like the writing is intuitive.
Oh, it's something akin to maybe a guitar player who can just kind of tune the guitar by ear. You don't necessarily have to go and get out this tuner and like really fiddle with it. It's just like you kind of know it when you hear it. And I suspect through all your reading and all the stories you've written and all the research you've done, that like a certain story presents itself and you're like, oh, I can kind of see, like, to use a golf term on a putting green, like I can kind of see the line, curving to the hole.
Yeah. And I guess you start to develop an eye for kind of themes and threads that are rising up through the research as you do it. I mean, in this case, the issue of names and naming started to rise up for me because, of course, we generally don't name livestock because we're going to eat them. And so in this case, there was this strange circumstance where you have these two herds of feral animals, one horses and one cows, and they all get swept off this island by a storm surge. But when I start to look into it, all of the horses have names. And of course, none of the cows have names. And yet it's the cows that survive. And at the very end, one of the cows is awarded a name by the human community. So you've got this, I was picking up those kinds of resonances, and pretty quickly, that turned into, well, this is how I'm going to start my story. I'm going to start it not with the cows. I'm going to start with the horses because they have names. And then we're going to work around to the fact, oh yeah, there are also some cows. They didn't have names, but hang around and see what they do.
Yeah, as I was progressing and reading through the piece, given how you started it with the names of all these horses and how they're named in these sort of isolated island communities on the Outer Banks, I was just like, all right, I really hope one of these cows gets a name. And I was like, sure. At the end, I'm like, yes, it got a name.
That's exactly the subconscious tickle that I was aiming for. And yeah, I mean, if that's what you experience, then I can die happy now. It's but I mean, it was just so astonishing when I did learn eventually that one of these cows had been named, and I was just like, wow, like they go from nameless to named, and it's just such a crystallization of how learning the story of one of these survivor cows can kind of it can certainly put your thoughts about cows on a new trajectory.
Yeah, and given that, you come across this story and you start, you maybe, and I'm just presupposing, that maybe you have, an idea of how it's going to unfold in your head before you've done the lion's share of the reporting. But then you start going there and you start, you doing your work, doing the rigorous interviewing and so forth. In what ways did this story, maybe in particular, surprise you, or maybe throw you a curveball and sent you on a different trajectory than you had originally envisioned when you set out to do it?
I think probably, well, there's a few. I mean, most basically, I now, really understand that cows can swim. And it's amazing, actually, as I talked about this story with friends and acquaintances and so on, that question came up again and again. People were saying, well, cows can swim. And then, of course, you remind them, you remember the Wild West films where the cows swim across the ford of the river. And then people go, oh, yeah. But it shows how profoundly we underestimate cows as beings, I suppose. So that was, that's kind of a very shallow level one, but more profoundly, I think learning about how more cows used to be like these cows. And when they were like these cows, we had a different relationship with them. That really struck me and was completely surprising to me in the research. So I learned through these kind of heritage livestock experts about these Spanish colonial cattle and their descendants, and how these cows used to be. I mean, they're just so tough. They can eat whatever. They can drink brackish water. They can handle the heat. They can handle the cold. They can defend themselves from predators. They're just almost a completely different animal to what we see in the industrial cattle production world today. And when the cattle were like that, people really respected them kind of in the way that we respect horses. So you would have these ranchers who, in some of the research I read, they talk about how the ranchers would get upset if somebody brought a dog to the cattle roundup because they didn't think it was respectful for anybody to round up their cattle with dogs. Or they resisted the idea of fencing these cattle because they thought, it was unbecoming of one of these Spanish colonial type cattle to be confined by fences. And in the main report that I read about these older heritage types of cattle, the author kind of says, thinking about these cows, maybe we too should not be fenced in, and maybe we too were not born to be fenced in. And suddenly you've got the cow as a symbol of liberty. So that really kind of stretched my expectations, certainly. I mean, I thought we'd kind of get into the nitty gritty of how individual cows, how is it that some cows were able to kind of dig deep and persevere with that kind of survival mindset that we recognize as being important in human survival situations. I thought we'd get into that. That didn't shock me too much. But the way it kind of opened this window to the much broader human-cow relationship took me by surprise.
And as you were, generating your early drafts and then working with Jonah on this, what were the conversations you were having, editor and writer, as you were beginning to shape this into what it would eventually become?
We didn't really have a lot of conversations on this one.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about what I kind of needed to scare up when I was on my trip to Cedar Island, where this cow swim occurred. But I think, right from the proposal stage, we were on the same page about what this thing was, which was a narrative-driven story about a narrative-driven survival story with a side of human-cow relationship analysis. And it never really changed.
Yeah, and maybe you can speak to just being with ambitious pieces of this nature, longer pieces. I think the draft release that I have that I read is around a little more than 8,000 words, right? Between 8,000 and 9,000, we'll say. And that's a long piece. But so what was what's it like for you on your end? Having been edited and being edited on a piece of this nature, because it is it's an ambitious piece to write, but of course it's also an ambitious piece to edit.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been terrific. I think, oddly enough, this was kind of part of my first real effort to start trying stories that really had strong narratives at the core of them. Mm-hmm. And prior to this, I'd really written more in kind of essay styles, particularly reported essays. And those would generally have storytelling elements, but they weren't really powerfully narrative driven. And that may be because early in my career, I had one editor say, "You don't really get narrative." And and I was like, "Oh yeah? Well, I'll just go to my dictionary and look up what narrative means," because I really didn't know what narrative meant. I'm more or less self-taught as a writer. I didn't study it in university, and I actually, if I'd been put on the spot in that moment, would not have been able to define narrative. So I really didn't know, and probably was a bit shy about approaching narrative-driven stories. But after this last book, I was just really craving the opportunity to write something with a powerful narrative, because it, it kind of powers itself, right? And you don't have to crunch it as much as you do an essay, for example. It's difficult in new ways, but in terms of where does it start, like what's the start, middle, and end, narratives are a lot clearer that way. So this was kind of my first big narrative project. And the editing there, I think that's where the editing from Jonah has been really, really helpful. Was kind of, he said, there's a lot of the diversions in this piece are fun, but there's a lot of them. And we really need to let the narrative rise up and breathe. And that, I think, was kind of the main work of the editing. But it was really kind of a pleasure for me, because I could recognize right away that this was something I needed to learn about, pieces that are powered by narrative first and foremost. And it was kind of beautiful to watch how stripping things away allowed it to rise and become so much more visible.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how that can happen. I've never had an Atavist level edit yet in my writing career, just based on the outlets that I've been published in. Grateful as I am, I just haven't had that degree of narrative editing, even line editing, where just you think you're turning in something that is like really sharp and clean, and it turns out to be just like a total bloodbath when you get it back. But it must have been just a really that must have been really illuminating just to see what it's like to be like, okay, you know, I really initially I felt a lot of this stuff needed to be there, and then when it fell away, it was like, oh my God, this thing is like, it's like a perpetual motion machine now that I've like stripped away so much of like the drag.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's I think what I was doing in probably the first draft was I would lose confidence that the narrative could do it on its own, and so I'd be like,
right,
let's throw down some Easter eggs, you know, let's take a essay like diversion down the history of the discovery of this peculiar variety of storm surge that I talk about in the story, and then Jonah, I think, came in and he said, some of these diversions, you know, let's stick with these. Others, a fair number of others, let's remove those. And it was, I mean, it was really just a reminder to me that you can be confident in a good narrative. If you have a good narrative, you can be confident that it can run itself to a pretty good degree, and you don't need to be doing handstands and cartwheels along the way.
Well, yeah, that's just it. It gets you. Well, you brought up, you know, David Foster Wallace earlier because Consider the Lobster was, you know, something of a formative text as you were writing this, and talk about someone who is, you know, fireworks and cartwheels. You know, a lot of us sometimes get into this racket because we're so inspired by that we want to have a similar imprint on the literary scene, as lofty as that sounds, or douchey as that sounds. but you like those experiences that we have by reading someone of that nature, a stylist, and you're like, oh man, that is so cool. Like, I want to do that. But then sometimes you realize, like, oh, when you try to do that, you're sounding like someone else who's already done it, like, and more power to them. But you realize that you're just putting too much weight in the boat, and you're really sagging the hull, where really you need to get rid of so much of that ballast, because you're slowing down the thing as you're trying to imitate these people to your own detriment.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite aspects of the process is when you get to that place where you're stripping things away. I'm generally not somebody who hesitates to murder darlings. I mean, I can get that way probably more at the line level, like at the level of the wording of a sentence, than I can about, like, let's remove this whole chunk that I might have thought was pretty wonderful, but I kind of recognize now that often when you do that, you just immediately see greater clarity. It's kind of like when you've been sitting around trying to figure out how to fix some highly convoluted line in a story, and then you realize you can just say, like, they went out the door, you know, like it's and then you just feel this great sense of relief that you've hit the simplicity that gives it the depth.
Well, it to that point, like, if you're, I don't know, just decluttering your wardrobe or something, and you're coming across, you know, shirts and especially t-shirts, you know, things you're like, oh man, I remember this thing. But then it's like, you know, you get rid of it and it kind of stings at first, but in a week, in a month, forget about a year, you don't even remember that you had the thing. And it's like, it's the same thing when you're line editing and killing darlings. It's just like, it's some things that seem so precious, when you strip it away in service of the whole, you're like, oh, I don't even remember that line that seemed so important to me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes back again to, I think, the entire culture of writing and how much weight it appears to put on beautiful language instead of beautiful structure. And I think we can really get bound up in trying to, just trying to produce beautifully written sentences with wonderfully well-chosen words. And, I think you can easily get lost in those kinds of darlings, that's for sure. And it's the appreciation for structure and how much force and beauty structure can bring to writing that that make it, easier, I think, to say, no, like let's strip things away, because we want that structure, that underlying structure, to be visible to the reader. And when it is, you don't want it visible in the sense that they can see every lever you're pulling, but you just want the beautiful architecture to catch their eye, and not just be buried in blackberry vines.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's kind of like when you see a Tesla on the road, you're noticing like the beautiful lines of the design, and like that's intentional. It is certainly style, but it also is not hitting you over the head. So there's that fine balance. You'd be like, oh, that looks elegant and beautiful, but it's not ostentatious and like over the top. And I think with a piece of writing, you want to be able to show like nice, smooth contours, smooth lines, without saying like, hey, look at me, look at this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think so often writing that structure can just get covered up by language, just by the incredible efforts that we sometimes go to as writers to just, pick just the right word or produce that rich description of something. And yeah, there's certainly, it's not that I don't pay attention to those things, but over time I've become more and more appreciative of the fact that the underlying structure is often what gives the most force to a piece of writing, rather than dazzling word choices, I suppose.
Sure. Or even like compound modifiers that are just like that can be, let's say, in the hands of somebody else, can be like, oh, it's over the top. There's a particular novelist that I won't throw under the bus. That's something I read from their work a long time ago. I'm like, oh my God, another compound modifier. Let's just like pump the brakes on this. As someone who has overused similes to his detriment, it's like, so I know what it means to like go over the top with things. You're trying to be too clever to describe something. But one compound modifier in particular that I really loved from your piece was just a very small thing about describing how a cattle walks, and you just say like a walking on the moon gait, and it was just like such a really wonderful thing that I highlighted. I'm like, there's a little dollop of style amidst everything that gives you a little glimpse of who you are as a writer.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. It's like I say, it's not that I don't pay any attention to those things. I certainly do, and I hope also that by dropping in a flourish like that, but not too often, that they do stand out a little bit more and kind of grab the reader's attention in a way that they might not if I was laying that on really thick and heavy.
Well, it's kind of like if you're having like a well-composed dessert and there's like lime zest or lemon zest, and you're like, oh, that's a nice little pop of flavor. When it's well balanced, or like the right amount of salt and you get a little citrus zest, it's like, holy shit, that's kind of lighting up my palate. And I think that's exactly what you've done with like a little zest like that, with something like that. It's like, oh, cool. Like that tasted nice.
Well, yeah, that's good to hear. Of course. As I say, this kind of structural stuff is something I thought about a lot, and often, I'll ask people about writers they like, and they'll say, "Oh, I like such and such writer," and I'll say, "What do you like about their writing?" "Oh, they're just, the writing is just so beautiful. It's so descriptive. It's so, they're just always getting just the right word." And then I'll go and look at the writing, and it'll be pretty straightforward. It'll be somebody just kind of laying down words, very few of them 3 or more syllables. They'll call things that are blue. They won't say they're cerulean. They won't say they're azul. It's what,
let the reader have their own blue.
Yeah,
in a way.
And
right?
what you find, what I find with, often when I look at it is that no, those pieces are just beautifully well put together. And so that blue, the description of something as blue is just doing exactly the work it needs to do, and no more and no less. The whole form that the piece has taken is what's generating the sense in the reader that they are reading beautiful writing. But if you break it down to the actual word choices and how the sentences are composed, I mean, it's not Pushkin, right? It's often pretty straightforward stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of like what just kind of popped into my head is that if the writing process is kind of an uphill process, for the reader, it should be a downhill read. Like it should be easy and almost carried on by gravity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, I think, because it's something I always try and remind myself of now is that the reader isn't paying anywhere near as much attention to what I've written as I did.
Yeah.
Not even probably 1%, right? They're probably giving it 1% of the attention that I gave it. And that has, I mean, it has a couple of effects. One is that it's made me a lot less concerned about whether, I say and or, and I would never get into those kinds of editorial battles where it's just, should we say this word or that word? I'm just like, the reader's not going to care. It's just a big one. There's that aspect of it, but also, understanding that you need to, that you really need to make things, you really need to make what you're doing pretty plain, pretty, not, as I say, in such a way that it's that fine line, I guess, between the reader feeling like you're hitting them on the head with what you're trying to do, and the reader just not noticing, but kind of wandering through this house where they just say, wow, these stairs, the banister on these stairs is just the height that I want it to be. And it's so smooth. And, and just where they feel like they might want to sit and gaze out the window, there's a comfortable chair. That's really what I'm trying to do without the reader ever noticing, of course.
Now, as the piece, publishes, oftentimes now it's incumbent upon the writer to engage in some degree of, promotion of the thing and engage in that post-publication thing where you have to be like, as much as uncomfortable as I might be in this, I have to be like, hey, look at me. This thing is out there. I hope you will read it and so forth. So, for you, how have you metabolized or processed that part of the publication journey where it is now time for you to be like, okay, it's time to tweet this out and then engage in that whole process?
I mean, you're definitely right that this is not not this. This is actually very enjoyable. I love talking about writing, but yeah, the promotions process is not my absolute favorite part of the writing process. That's for sure. But what I have realized with it, something that you can learn from it, I suppose, is that it's when you go out to promote any story or book, it kind of really demands that you have the idea of that piece of writing reduced to a very simple form, which is really helpful in a professional sense, in that this is often what you have to do when you pitch, right? So, when you pitch a story, or if you have that kind of 3 seconds in the elevator, you need to have the core idea of the story crystallized in your mind. And publicity and promotions, that process is really good for that. And I'm not at all inclined that way. I mean, I'm a highly recursive thinker and often a highly recursive speaker. And I tend to sort of see the things I'm working on as containing the universe and not being a single grain of sand. But it's very helpful for me actually to have to go out and, talk to an audience or be interviewed by media about a book I've written or a story I've produced.
What's kind of really cool about hearing you, think that through is that it comes back right to the start. It comes right back to the pitch.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you eventually had to sell an editor or a publication on the idea, and you go through that whole rigmarole, and then as it's coming to light, it's almost like it's coming right back to the central tenet of what got you excited about it and also got someone else excited about it to pay you for it, and that's going to be what ultimately sells it to the readership.
Yeah, and I'm starting to realize just how valuable it is to try and get there earlier in the process, because I wrote my first book quite a few years ago now, and it was about an uncle of mine who was assassinated in the Dominican Republic in 1965, an uncle I never met. But I wrote a book about that. I mean, like many people, I did a family story as a first book. And then it really wasn't until like late in the editing process for that book that I realized the whole underlying theme was forgiveness. And what do we need in order to forgive? And how do we forgive? And is forgiveness different for different people? All these kinds of things. Well, how handy it would have been to have realized that early in the process and not at the end. It probably would have, I mean, it certainly would have changed everything about how I approached writing the book. And it would have made it a better book. As I say, this has been kind of a gradual realization for me, because my brain is not inclined towards reduction. I think it's inclined towards expansion. But I've started to realize that it's very important to try to kind of reduce things and get that clear-eyed sense of why I'm interested in writing about things, so that whatever it is that drew my eye can power me throughout the entire reporting and writing process.
Well, that's amazing stuff. And well, JB, as I like to bring these conversations down for a landing, I always love asking the guest for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners, and that can be anything that you find cool or fun, be it a brand of coffee or a fanny pack. And so I would extend that to you, JB, as we're bringing this down. Like, if there's anything that is exciting you that you would recommend to the listeners out there, what might that be?
I'm going to actually do a little shout out for maybe an underappreciated nonfiction outlet, and that is
cool.
That is a place called Hakai Magazine, and it's HAKAI magazine.com, and they're just they're a great literary science magazine up here in British Columbia, and just doing all kinds of like really interesting stuff. And it feels like a place where, as a writer, the reins are kept pretty loose. You get to breathe a little when you're doing a piece for Hakai. And I just would like more. I think it's a place that deserves more readers and more writers as well.
I think that's really cool. And what's really good to underscore is that I think a lot of us as writers, there are, the big headlining outlets where, we'd love to see our work published just because it reaches more readers, but it also kind of scratches that itch that our ego wants, for the prestige purposes, especially among writers. Like, for readers, publishers don't matter, but for writers, like, yeah, we know we know those publishers that are like the really cool ones that would be really nice to have like on your CV. But like when you're reading, let's say, an essay collection, say like Best American Essays or Sports Writing or whatever, and I'm sure there are any number of anthologies of that nature in Canada as well. What's wonderful is that, like, say, you can look in the main collection, but also in the notable selections, is you'll see all these other publications that you have never heard of, and they're doing that kind of work that you're obviously attracted to. So it's giving you more ideas of more or places to pitch. Like, I never even knew who like N+1 was a few years ago. I'm like, they publish like surfing things, and isn't that kind of cool? And so you start to be able to cast a wider net to get the work you want published, and here. It's a way to get your stuff out there, and it's not the New Yorker or Outside Magazine. or there are all these places doing amazing work, and you're saying you saying that Hackeye Magazine is just another example of cool places doing amazing work.
Yeah, and I think it's often those places that are a little bit off the beaten path where you can explore your style and your voice a little more readily than you can with the sort of bigger, more established houses. I mean, yeah, they've got. Well, for one thing, you're just going to be too terrified to really like flex your writerly muscles for these bigger outlets. But yeah, working with a smaller place, I mean, you're still going to get, in many cases, really superb editing, but you're also going to get to maybe try some things that you wouldn't dare to try in a pitch or a proposal to one of the big outlets. So, yeah, I kind of swing between the two and have throughout my writing career so far.
Fantastic. Well, JB, this was amazing to get to talk to you about how you went about this really cool piece for the Atavist. So I just commend you on a job well done, and thanks for coming on the show to talk shop. This is a lot of fun.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really appreciate it.
All right, big up CNFers, and thanks to the great Jonah Ogles and JB Mack for the time. Head to magazine.atavist.com to subscribe to the Atavist. Some of the best $25 you'll spend in a year, let me tell you. You get great stories, access to their archives, and you're supporting the incredible storytelling they're doing. I don't get any kickbacks, so you know my recommendation is as true as they come. Still New Jersey. Going to be here for another few days or so before I hit the road back to Oregon. And my father-in-law, he's big on watching the local news. Trust me, there's a point to this little parting shot. And it got me thinking about local anchors and TV personalities and how some make it to the big time, kind of move their way up to bigger markets, and others either thrive or languish in the small regional markets. You have to figure that for some of them, if not all of them, they wanted to maybe be the next Diane Sawyer, or Katie Couric, Dan Rather, or Dan Patrick, if you're into sports. And yet, somewhere along the line, they either chose lifestyle over ambition, or they simply weren't good enough, or maybe didn't have the look or the polish. Who knows? And I wonder if they're sad at where they are, or if they've made peace with it, or if this is where they wanted to be all along. Like when I was in Saratoga, working for a little newspaper up there, the Saratogian, we had a guy who did so much game coverage. He didn't do any pagination like a lot of us had to do as well as game coverage, but he was just he was a machine. Probably had 2 or 3 stories a day, an occasional feature. Like I said, just a machine. But he wasn't a good writer at all. Everyone knew it. He was objectively average, and that's probably stretching the compliment. And I got to thinking what it must be like to just totally plateau in a small market and not be able to rise up out of it. Like, is there more? Is that sad? Is that an admission of defeat to stay there? Now, for frequent listeners of the show, you know how impossibly frustrated I've been over the years with my own development as a purveyor of the mighty true tale. I'm coming to terms that I might just have to be like kind of a small tier local guy, like a local TV anchor. Maybe even start my own thing because the gatekeepers don't exactly like me behind the velvet rope. I don't know what the answers are. I don't know if doing my own thing is an admission of defeat or an act of creative courage. On some level, we all seek the validation and prestige that comes with an elevated, invisible tier of publication, and if you're kept from it, maybe you're unlucky, maybe you don't pitch enough, or maybe you're just not good enough. You know, that guy I spoke about earlier, nobody in their right mind at, let's say, The Athletic or ESPN.com or The New Yorker, Sporting Scene, we'll keep it in sports because it was sports, would ever publish his things. But you know what, though? The guy was beloved, or is beloved, in upstate New York. He's, by all accounts, a really happy guy, and he's a great guy. And maybe that's all that matters. Like, maybe we shouldn't be so swept up in these trivial matters of publication in glossy magazines. Like, are we getting even a little bit better every day? Are we having at least a little bit of fun? Are we, causing no harm? Are we paving the road and filling in potholes for the people coming up the road behind us? Greasing the skids, if you will. Then I suppose if you were doing those kind of things, then that's a pretty meaningful way to go about a career. And maybe that should be the focus. Not necessarily on these merit badges we can pin on our sash. Anyway, stay wild, CNFers. If you can't do, interview. See ya.